Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. It's holiday week, and man, I've got so much to be thankful for, especially you, the Word Balloon listeners. Great feedback. 2019 has really been an incredible year, and I have you to thank for it. Questions or comments about the show, reach me via email, john@wordballoon.com. I keep getting great email from listeners. Thank you very much for the encouragement and the support. Follow me on Twitter under John Word Balloon. Follow me on Facebook under my name, John Suntress, and also the Word Balloon Network. And, of course, I've got my YouTube channel. Lots of videos up there, more coming, right under Word Balloon. Check it out. And it's going to be a whole week of fantastic episodes of new conversations and classic old conversations. Great feedback about the old stuff as well. I thank you. Thank you for listening to all the commercials. I've got one more commercial before the show starts, and then we'll get underway. But as always, I thank you for your attention and the support. Thanks very much. Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Last week I put out Christos Gage, and great conversation. Chris talked about working on television, the Daredevil series for Netflix, and of course, among other current projects, he's bringing back Gwen Stacy, the 616 Gwen Stacy, the real Gwen Stacy, if you will, not Gwen Poole, not Spider-Gwen, great versions of Gwen Stacy, don't get me wrong. But we're going to get a great mini-series from him and Todd Knock about Gwen's time in high school, Captain Stacy, her father. What was she doing in the Spider-Verse when Peter wasn't swinging around, or while Peter was swinging around, really? And it made me think, as I bring back some classic word balloons for you every month, wouldn't it be fun to hear about the death of Gwen Stacy? Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. No, it's among Gerry Conway's amazing stories, the death of Gwen Stacy, the Spider-Man-Superman team-up, the first great merging of Marvel and DC, with amazing art from Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito, the creation of The Punisher, the creation of Firestorm. Not only that, but Gerry started writing comics when he was 15 years old. Amazing. And I'll tell you, as I say in my first conversation with Gerry, the death of Gwen Stacy really blew my mind. I mean, I'm a guy that grew up with the superheroes and their girlfriends. We had the imaginary stories where Lois Lane would die and things like that. But, nobody really died in comics until, Bucky died, I guess, retrospectively. But as far as girlfriends, Gwen Stacy. I was 9 when I first read it. And again, I read the reprint. I read it in Marvel Tales. I didn't read it in Amazing Spider-Man. I'm not that old. But it blew my 9-year-old mind. Because I was right there with Peter on that rooftop saying, you can't be dead. I saved you. What the hell just happened? And him screaming to the sky, Goblin, I'm going to get you. Like I said, it blew my mind, I think, in a very imaginative and creative way from a storytelling standpoint that sticks with me today. I think that's why I'm still talking to these people, and I'm curious about the origins of some of these amazing stories. And we get into that with Gerry. We also get into so much more. These are classic word balloons from 2009 and 2013, and I'm happy to bring them back to you today during holiday week. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. We're going to start things off with a great double conversation with Gerry Conway. Lots of interesting stuff, very introspective about Superman as well. A couple of years ago, he had a fantastic, in 2009, a great miniseries, The Last Days of Animal Man. And I thought that was a terrific coda to Animal Man, a possible final story that he did with Chris Batista. But you'll hear more about that and a couple other projects as well. Gerry Conway on today's Word Balloon, brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you, League, for your support. Thanksgiving, thank you, absolutely. And, don't worry, kids. This isn't the only release that's coming Thanksgiving week. There's going to be more. But if you're a subscriber via Patreon, you've already been given the opportunity to listen to a coming Matt Fraction conversation that will be part of the Thanksgiving release here at Word Balloon. But the patrons got it first. And as I inch closer to one of my goals at Patreon, more Word Balloons will come first to the League of Word Balloon listeners. Hey, Word Balloon's free. It'll always be free. I want as many people to listen as they can and enjoy the conversations as much as I do when I get to do them. But if you like what you hear at Word Balloon and you want to subscribe, help out the cause, go to patreon.com/wordballoon and you can, click on it there. Is Word Balloon worth $1 a month to you? Is it worth $5 a month to you, the price of a comic book a month to you? I hope so. But if you think so and you can swing it, that'd be great. Patreon.com/wordballoon, or click on the Patreon ad at wordballoon.com. But thank you greatly for your support, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. Lots to be thankful for from Aftershock. Word Balloon is also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. Hey, man, Aftershock has a great December lineup that, man, I'll tell you, some of these titles sound fantastic. We've got things like The Man Who Effed Up Time. I think that explains the concept right there in its description. You'll also get from Marguerite Bennett Animosity Year 2. They're also re-releasing Year 1, so you can catch up on Animosity quite easily. And also there's a trade paperback of Animosity Volume 5. So several ways to enjoy Animosity coming up. There's Dark Ark After the Flood, number 5. Undone by Blood. Shoplifters Will Be Liquidated, number 5. Pestilence, the complete series hardcover, is coming out this month in December. And God Killers. All interesting books, all brand new from Aftershock, joining the ranks of great books from Tim Seeley and Cullen Bunn, Marguerite Bennett, Garth Ennis. So many great Aftershock creators that are deserving of your attention. You know the names. Check out these new, fresh concepts from them and Aftershock Comics. Go to their website. You'll find full story descriptions, preview pages, and the diamond codes on how to order these books through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. All right, without further ado, I'm going to give you the old Word Balloon intros on each of these segments. But first up, from 2009, here's a conversation with Gerry Conway on Word Balloon. Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. This is John Suntress. Today, a conversation with legendary writer Gerry Conway. Gerry made his mark at DC and Marvel early in his career, working on both companies' biggest icons, significant runs on Superman and Spider-Man in particular, including their first team-up in that deluxe Treasury edition of the 1970s with artist Ross Andru. We'll be talking about his pair-ups with Ross and other classic Marvel artists, including John Romita, Gil Kane, and talk about some of the big moments in the Marvel and DC universe that Gerry was responsible for, like the birth of the Punisher and the death of Gwen Stacy. Gerry spent a good portion of the 90s and early 2000s writing for the TV series Law & Order, but he's back to comics, working for DC, looking at Buddy Baker, Animal Man, 25 years down the line in his career, and suddenly finding his powers are fading. It's The Last Days of Animal Man, a 6-issue miniseries from DC Comics, with art from Chris Batista. The conversation with Gerry begins with a look at his return to the comic book scene. I have to ask, and I know you've covered this in some written interviews that you've done, what brought you back to comics? Because, as you say, you've had a wonderfully successful career in television and film, and particularly in television, Law and Order. You're one of their go-to guys, and were for so many years. Why back to comics?
Well, for a variety of reasons. I think primarily the difference between working in film and television and working in comics, at least at the level that I can work, is in film and television, you're constrained by the financial imperatives of the medium. This is a very high-risk medium where, for an average episode, for example, of a show like Law and Order, you're talking about a budget of $2.5 million
Wow.
for an episode. That's a big risk.
Yeah.
So the amount of supervision, interference, oversight that you're going to experience, even if you're, a respected writer, is going to be tremendous. By contrast, the financial investment in a issue of a comic book is relatively minor. So if you're someone who is, I think well thought of, or has a track record, you're more likely to be allowed a certain amount of independence in your writing than you would be in film or television. So, as someone who's worked in the television and film world for about 20 years, and accomplished a fair amount, I also banged my head against that wall, that creative wall, more than a few times, and found it to be kind of frustrating, and certainly in comparison to the amount of freedom that I would have writing comics. So about a couple of years ago, I pretty much hung up my shingle, where I actually took my shingle down, let's put it that way, as a television writer, and turned away from that particular part of my career, and have been sort of casting around trying to decide what it was that I'd like to do for an encore, and returning to comics where I have a certain amount of history and a fan base and an interest that I have just for it as a medium. Seemed like a kind of a natural move.
I know a lot of current writers that will cite, there are the obvious stories like the death of Gwen Stacy that, they'll cite as classic. And I know there's a great contingent of current writers like Brad Meltzer and Jeff Johns who are a big fan of JLA Detroit, one of your babies. Yeah. And so
I'm always amazed by that. Given the amount of, what's funny is that the things that you get criticized for or that you get a lot of flack for at the time often end up being what you're best remembered for fondly, by people years later, which is really amazing to me.
Sure.
And kind of counterintuitive. It's like you'd expect that the work that gets you praise and respect at the time, would be what you would be remembered and respected for later, but often that's not the case.
Well, let's talk about this current story, The Last Days of Animal Man.
Yes.
I go back to some printed interviews that I've read of yours, and I think it's interesting and wonder if, as you return to comic books, as a writer, do these initial stories come to you in the form of a premise versus a specific character? Tell me, because I think I had read that maybe you started with a different hero in mind for this story, and then found a good fit as well with Buddy Baker, Animal Man.
Well, actually, what happened in this case was that I came up with the premise, the notion. I was playing around in my mind. What stories do I want to tell?
Mm-hmm.
When I was, a young man, when I was in my late teens and early 20s and writing books like Spider-Man, I was writing about myself. I was writing Peter Parker at the same age. I was the same age that he was as a character, so I could relate to his experiences. But today, I wouldn't necessarily think that I'd be able to immediately relate to Peter Parker's issues. But I could relate to the idea of someone, looking at his life from the viewpoint of a major change in his ability to accomplish the things that he used to be able to accomplish. In other words, like a midlife crisis, which is a natural part of growing older. And I thought, what's the metaphor for that in terms of a superhero? Well, in terms of a superhero, it's a character who is going through the crisis of losing his powers. And not losing them because, he's been exposed to red kryptonite or because he's been attacked by a villain, who's, got some machinations against him, but, just as a natural part of life, this happens. And what would you do, if you're this character? Well, I didn't have a specific character in mind, primarily because the way that the comic book business is run these days, all of these characters have ongoing, and rather complicated storylines that are interwoven with each other. So for me to come in and say, hey, how about we do a story where Aquaman, suddenly can't breathe underwater anymore, is not a practical suggestion.
Okay.
So I came to Joey Cavalieri, who had been asking me if I had any notions for a story, and I said, this is the basic idea. Do you have a character that you think this would fit? Does DC have someone that they think would, be a suitable protagonist for this? And they came back with the idea of let's do it with Animal Man. Let's set it, in the future so that we don't have to worry about continuity. And it really worked. I thought, this is a guy who's an everyman type of character. Father, husband, an ordinary guy in his real world life. It would make a really good fit for this particular premise.
He is definitely one of those everyman heroes, and I know that a lot of the successful writers with him have portrayed him as such. As someone who came back to comics, and I know that you did a lot of research on Buddy, what did you think of some of the runs like Grant Morrison's run and some of the stories that have been told already about Animal Man?
Well, I think you've got to my mind, there's two separate existences for Animal Man. There's the existence in which he is part of the regular DC universe, and then there's the existence in which he was a character in a Grant Morrison series at Vertigo.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some overlap in that these are both the same guy. But the Grant Morrison stories are not so much about Buddy Baker as they are about comic books. You know, they're a deconstruction of comic book storytelling, not really driven by an internal set of issues that Buddy Baker is going through. They're more driven by interests that Grant Morrison, as a writer, is bringing to it. So, to me, Grant's stories, while I have to reference the internal material that occurs in those stories, are not really relevant to the story that I'm telling, because he was telling a different kind of comic book story.
Okay.
He was telling a story about comic book stories.
Sure. No, you're absolutely right.
Right. You know, it's just not... that's not what I'm doing. I'm telling a story about Buddy Baker,
mm-hmm.
A guy in his late 40s, early 50s, who's experiencing a natural change as a human being.
I think it's interesting that you've hit the ground running, creating a couple villains right away. We've only seen one right now. As we're recording this, issue 1's the only one that's been out. I understand there's a second one coming. But as you say, it seems middle age is really the villain in this story.
Well, I found this to be true when I came back to writing Spider-Man in the late 80s. I don't know whether this frustrated my editor or not, but I had, at that point, for whatever reason, I had lost, not interest, but I'd lost a certain amount of passion for the superhero part of the story. And I was more interested in what was going on for Peter Parker and Mary Jane and the cast of characters that surrounded him in his personal life as opposed to a superhero life. So I did a extended storyline that featured those characters, and almost, I won't say as an afterthought, but it sort of flipped around the format that Stan had created, which was to do a superhero story with overtones of personal life stories filtered through it. And what I did was a story about Peter Parker with overtones of superhero stories filtered through that. And in the same sort of way, you can't do, to be interesting to a reader of comics, since it's a graphic and visual media with a lot of good possibilities for the action and the large-scale visuals, you can't just do an internal story by focusing on the internal conflict. You need to somehow express it through a physical and dynamic conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And the characters that I created for him to battle, I won't say they're metaphors, but they certainly reflect aspects of the issue. For
sure.
You have Blood Rage, who is physicality personified, and is, everything that Buddy isn't at this moment, a powerful physical entity that's driven purely by, his need for additional power. And the second character they were bringing in, which starts in the second issue, is this daughter of the illegitimate daughter of the second Mirror Master. And she's sort of emblematic of another aspect of what Buddy's going through, which is, how his powers affect the people around him. How his being a superhero has had an effect on the people around him, because she's an example of someone who was destroyed. Her life was destroyed by her father being a supervillain. So she has a very real, not a metaphoric sense, but again, sort of emblematic of the other issues that's going on for him. And I don't try to bang anybody over the head with this. Mostly what I do is I have Buddy being banged over the head by the villains. But it enables me to sort of do an externalization, of the internal drama.
Well, and his kids are so young in the current DC universe, and they haven't come into the story yet. But will we see them in this?
Yeah.
Okay, so clearly we're going to deal with, I guess...
we're going to see Maxine as a young adult and Cliff as a young adult. And we're going to see how they've been affected by having a father who, lived the life that Buddy lived. I mean, it's not a story in which there are in which the main characters come off particularly well or particularly badly. I mean, they come off like people, I hope, with strengths and flaws. And Buddy, as both a hero and as a human being, has his strengths and his flaws, and how they affect the people in his life, is part of what the story is, and how Maxine and Cliff, growing up in that, have become the people that they've become, is also part of that.
That's great. I'm only about 10 or 12 years younger than you. I'm 44 and grew up reading the different stages of comic book writing in what was once, I think, books that were written for a 12-year-old audience. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But
no, really, absolutely right.
You also were very active through the late 80s and early 90s, where we had the initial deconstructive period. And now I think today's more successful writers are able to tell these very personal human stories with, just as you say, using the action as not only a metaphor, but you've got to have something exciting to read, to look at while they're dealing with the internal conflict. But there have been a few writers that have been kind of knocked for what is called decompressed storytelling, and I wonder if you saw that same characteristic when you read a lot of today's books by the current younger writers.
Well, I think like in any large group of people, there's a variety, of approaches and talents.
Mm-hmm.
The best of the writers today, I think, do try to combine these things, and to do it seamlessly and to do it without, being obvious about it. We don't want, in a way, as being like magicians, we don't want you to know how we're doing the trick, right? So,
okay, fair enough.
A good writer doesn't want it to be so obvious, that this is what they're doing. I think people like Jeff Johns, Brad Metzer, Jeff Loeb, are all people who, get it, and bring that kind of balance, to their storytelling. In terms of people who are mostly interested in just doing the conversation or just doing the talk, the talking heads, I can empathize. I feel like that's something I was sort of into in the late 80s, where, as I said, I sort of flipped it around and was doing stories about Peter Parker, in which the Spider-Man stories were, the secondary element.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's hard, I think, for some writers, to get past the boredom,
Sure.
with the standard material, and you either come back to it, and I'm very grateful that I've had this opportunity to come back to it, because I feel like I'm past the boredom. I was bored with this material at one point, just because I had done so much of it, and I knew how it worked. Now I come back to it, and I'm like, oh well, this is kind of fun. This is a fun way to break up a story, to make things happen, and to keep me interested. But I can sympathize, and empathize with writers who, just get tired of writing an action scene, and they're more interested in what's going on in that conversation, and they forget that you can do both. You can have a conversation in the middle of an action scene,
Sure.
and it can be fun. So it's just, and this is fine. The field is big enough now that you can do all these different kinds of things.
Tell me about working with your artists today as opposed to back in the 70s and 80s, and I know I was reading, in particular, a concentration of your JLA work, and I was going to ask you, too, what it was like to work with a guy like Dick Dillon, and was surprised to read that you really didn't have any personal contact with him. It was really through the editor, you submitting a script. And also the interesting thing that you said after a time you were able to figure out what his strengths were and the ability to write to those strengths. Is it more of a direct collaboration today for you?
Not on this particular job. I've never met Chris.
Okay.
And I've been writing my scripts in advance. I've done it in what we used to call DC style, but both companies now do it both ways. They do Marvel style and DC style, where they either break the story down and provide dialogue after the art, or write a full script in advance. Mm-hmm. And in this particular one, I've been writing a script in advance, and I just finished issue 4.
Okay.
And all I've really seen is issue 1. I haven't seen the pencils on any of the other issues. And I take it back. I saw half of the pencils on issue 2, but I haven't really seen in depth, the work. And I honestly, I'm having fun with that. I like being surprised by what Chris is doing. I'm trying to be very consistent in my writing, so that I don't pull the rug out from under him by throwing something in later, and doing one of these. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that that in this particular location there's this device, that I didn't happen to mention 5 pages ago.
Okay.
So I'm trying to play fair with him and alert him to where I'm going as I'm writing the script. And that's something that I've learned from writing television and working with directors in television. Learning what they need to do their job, so that they can visualize the drama that I've put on the page.
You did, obviously, at the start say the differences between writing comics and writing for television. Is a full script, because a lot of people that listen to the show are curious about the craft of writing as well. So I'm curious, are your full scripts different from what they were 15 years ago or 20 years ago?
They are. I like to think that they're more thought out. I wrote by the seat of my pants back in the period that I was most prolific in comics. I was writing 5 to 6 titles a month.
Wow.
Full stories, and between 120 and 150 pages of comic books a month, which is an enormous amount of material.
Absolutely.
And out of that, I think I'd like to think that I wrote maybe, two-thirds of it was relatively good stuff. At least at the level that I wanted to be writing at. But the problem with it is that when you're writing that quickly, it's very hard to be reflective about what you're doing. You're sort of writing instinctively and from the gut, which is good, because when you're writing from the gut, you're writing what really matters to you, and you're tapping into your unconscious in a very productive way. But it's not being filtered. It's not being filtered by reflection or by the kind of insights that your conscious mind will bring to it. Or you'll say, oh, maybe I can foreshadow this a little bit better. If I can't foreshadow something if I don't know that I'm going to do it. This time around, writing Last Days, I know exactly where I'm going to end in this miniseries. I know what's happening in each issue before I come to it. I know what the structure of the story is going to be, and that enables me to set things up in ways that I didn't do before. So I'm happier with the result. I don't know whether it's a better result. That's a question that really you can't answer. But I know that it's a more crafted result. So in that sense, I think it's a more mature writing style.
Is it hard to transition from the 3-act television play to the 5-issue or 6-issue current comic book miniseries and story beats?
Not really, because both are based on classical structure. This is going to sound very pretentious, but there's really only one or two ways to structure a story. 3 acts is basically it. Actually, I will take it and extend it out to the 5-act structure that you have in Greek plays and in Shakespearean plays. And that, even in a 3-act structure, you're still doing the classical 5-act structure. You're just breaking it at different points.
Okay.
So a comic book story, a 6-part comic book story, actually works very well for the classical structure. Even though the classical structure is 5 parts, you can make it work fairly easily. Every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Every story, has an introduction, a crisis, a development of the crisis, a climax, a denouement, and an aftermath.
Sure,
That's basically it. And that's what you're doing with a comic book story. I actually knew that when I was writing before, so in a structural sense, my work hasn't changed that much.
Who were your early comic book influences that kind of helped shape your writing style?
In terms of story, I'd say Gardner Fox was a fairly influential writer. Gardner Fox and John Broome.
That's great.
Under Julie Schwartz, because they also worked in that kind of classical structure. They were what I took for them was their structure, not necessarily their language. In terms of the heart of the stories, I'd say it was Stan Lee, because Stan was the one who brought in the idea that stories should be about people, and what people are experiencing and what is happening to them on the inside, is reflected in what they're doing on the outside. And in terms of language, I'd say Roy Thomas was a very strong influence, and Denny O'Neil too, but less so. I mean, Denny. While I'm an admirer of Denny's work, I don't think I was ever influenced by it very much.
Okay.
I think that he and I sort of went on parallel tracks. I mean, he was influenced by some of the same things I was influenced by. So I consider he and I sort of are the same generation of writers, and Roy and Stan and Gardner are the previous generation.
I found it interesting looking at some of the early stuff that you had a hand on creating, and in particular 3 horror titles, where it seemed you did the first book, and then the books were handed on to different people. And I'm thinking of Werewolf by Night, Man-Thing, and Tomb of Dracula.
Yeah, actually in all 3 of those cases, it was a collaboration with Roy, too.
Okay.
Roy came up with the initial premises of all those books, and in some cases, I think he actually wrote a plot for the stories, and then I took them and developed it, internally and from a character point of view. So yeah, I mean, I think Werewolf by Night I was most connected with, of the 3 books. I wrote Werewolf, I think, for I want to say like 10 or 11 issues, but I'm not sure. I was sort of the go-to guy, the Johnny of all trades for Marvel and for DC over the years, because I'm a fairly facile, and this is also true in television. It was true for me. I'm facile at adapting my style to other people's styles, and that's not necessarily a talent that I think highly of, but it is one that I have.
Okay.
So I was able to come in and do stories in the voice of other writers, or follow up for Roy, for example, on something that he wanted to initiate. I could take it the next step, but usually there was always something else that they needed me to do, so I would move on to the next thing.
Well, you put such a stamp yourself on Spider-Man, and eventually I'm going to have to be the 100 millionth person probably to ask you about the death of Gwen Stacy. But before I do that, I'm very curious about the Punisher, and in particular, and again, this is probably something that you've been asked maybe 50,000 times as opposed to the death of Gwen Stacy, but the character that was it Mac Bolan, the Executioner?
Mac Bolan.
Yeah, was that a character that was being thought of in the creation for the Punisher?
Well, there were several characters. I mean, I was actually talking with someone else about this today. The Punisher was a reflection of the time that he was created in. We had this kind of vigilante, iconic mentality going on. We had Death Wish and
you bet.
Dirty Harry and the Executioner, as you say, were all very popular characters. So he was a character that I didn't expect or intend to be a mainline villain. I considered him, when I first developed him for the story, he was supposed to be a secondary character to the Jackal, a one-shot knockoff character. And I thought, well, it would be fun to do a take on this kind of vigilante character. But in the writing of it and in the art by Ross Andru, it became so interesting.
Absolutely.
It was like I could see that this guy had some potential beyond that, and the fan response was immediate. We immediately got people wanting to see more of him. So one thing led to another, and there he went.
Well, and you and Ross Andru were such an amazing team, and I should probably throw in Mike Esposito. I'm assuming he was the anchor on that stuff. Am I wrong, or?
He was the anchor on some of it, but we had John Romita inked some of it, and Frank Giacoia,
okay.
was an anchor. I forget. I think I'm not sure that Mike did ink that much of the Spider-Man stuff, because I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
I don't honestly remember.
Well, specifically you and Ross, then. I mean, that the wonderful Spider-Man Superman Treasury Edition book. I mean, that was just such a fun story. Were you able to work closer with Ross? I mean, when it was working Marvel style.
We worked very closely together.
Okay.
Ross and I, we had a very very similar approach to story. And I found that I could have a conversation with Ross about where we would take the first third of the story, and say, in like 20 or 30 minutes, we would break that down, and he would go off and do the pencils, and then I would be able to write the material, and it was like we were thinking the same way.
Wow!
So it was a very pleasant experience. There were some some artists that I've worked with where, it was a battle, where we never saw things quite the same, and I was always disappointed, and they were always frustrated, and that kind of thing. But with Ross, it was always smooth. It was smooth sailing. He was, I think, one of the more underrated artists in comics, somebody who should really be rediscovered. They talk about Marvel does these Marvel visionary books, and I really think they should be doing, Ross Andru Marvel visionary book.
I was pleased.
He really did, to my mind, the definitive 1970s Spider-Man. Was as important to Spider-Man's development as John Romita was in the 60s and Steve Ditko in the early 60s. But that's my opinion.
Well, I know a lot of fans that would agree, and I was happy to see that they are starting to collect your guys' run. I was talking to Mike Norton, one of the DC artists, and he's a huge fan of Ross Andru's, and when you guys were working together on Spider-Man, and he was even telling me, I told him I was going to talk to you, and he was like, I don't know why Marvel chose to do this at this time, but I'm glad they did. So maybe we'll see some more interest, and I hope more of your guys' work together does get collected, because it's certainly the Spider-Man of my childhood, and it was exciting stuff, and man, you really benefited from some amazing artists on Spider-Man, and now I'm gonna of course ask you that obligatory Gwen Stacy moment, because man, I got to tell you, it is still such an incredible scene and sequence of panels, and just that tragic, classic Spider-Man moment of, the success and failure of attempting to save her. Would you mind telling me, going back to the idea of, can we get Gwen Stacy? Getting permission from Stan and taking us through that whole process?
Sure. Actually, at that point, I had been on the book for maybe a year. I'm not sure how long I'd been on. Issue 21, I came on around 113. So yeah, maybe about less than a year. And I had been working with John Romita for most of that, and Romita was the dominant half of the partnership, as he should be, because he was a guy who had been around the character for many, many years and was, really the go-to guy as far as the storytelling on Spider-Man. So a lot of the stories that he and I did together were stories where I would come up with the premise, and then John would basically develop the story and the plot based on that overall premise. He was playing around with the idea. He wanted to do a story where we would kill off a main character, because he felt that it had gotten to the point where things were, settled and safe and simple. And he, as a fan, I think he was telling me this recently, as a fan of Milt Caniff, the cartoonist who did Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon, and he was saying that Caniff was a big proponent of the idea of shaking things up by killing off a main character now and then. And so John had pitched this to Stan and to me, and Stan said, sure. Stan at that point really wasn't paying attention to the material. He was building his empire, as the publisher at Marvel, expanding the books, working on trying to get us into different markets and so on. So he didn't really, and he trusted that we all knew what we were doing, so he had this kind of a hands-off attitude.
Okay.
And then, as we were talking about it, we came to the conclusion, I don't know whether it was, Romita was pushing for the idea of killing off Aunt May, and I didn't think that was a good idea, because in my mind, Aunt May was a stabilizing force in Peter's life, a touchstone that, if you removed it, would leave this gaping hole. How do you fill that relationship? There's nobody else who can be that person to him. But in terms of his girlfriends, in terms of the women that were in his life, he had gone through, several by that point. He'd had Liz Allen and Betty Brant, and there was always a sense that none of these women were permanent, with the exception of Mary Jane. To my mind, when I was a reader, and I was reading the comics at the point when Mary Jane was first introduced, she brought something to the mix that I had not ever seen before. A very capable, very individual female character who did not need the hero. She didn't need him.
I hear you.
She didn't care that he was there. She liked him. She was potentially available, but she wasn't on the make for Peter Parker.
I hear you.
Gwen Stacy, on the other hand, was more of a traditional superhero love interest. She was not an independent person in and of herself. She existed primarily. You got the feeling that if Peter went out of the room, she disappeared. There was no there with Gwen Stacy. And I'm not, and there you go. But so I never cared. I never thought there was anything about her that made her compelling. She didn't bring anything to the dance, as far as I was concerned. So I said, well, what about Gwen Stacy? Let's just get rid of her. That way we can clear the way for the really interesting character, Mary Jane. And there was sort of like, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And nobody thought anything one way or the other about it as being a good idea, bad idea. They had basically cleaned house with her dad. Was gone. So she and Harry Osborn had a relationship, but Harry Osborn had gone nuts.
Right.
With becoming the Green Goblin. So it really wasn't. She didn't really serve any function other than as the girlfriend. From a purely cold-hearted point of view, let's dump her and bring on the other girl. And that was it. We didn't think anything further of it. Now, in the telling of the story, it became much bigger. I think that because we felt like, okay, we're going to be killing off this character. Let's make it count. And that in the telling of it, it became much larger. It wasn't going to be just a building falls on her. It wasn't going to be, she does something heroic and saves the day. It was going to be the fulfillment of who she was. And if you come down to it, who she was, in my mind, her role was to be captured and held hostage. I mean, that's basically what she brought to the story.
The damsel in distress.
Yeah, she was the damsel in distress. Tie her to the railroad tracks. And my feeling was, well, what would be really interesting is if the train actually ran over her.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, we're always saying, get to her before the train, and so on. Or what if you pull her away from the train and she gets run over by a truck? When you pull her away from the train. That was my perversity, which was the idea that the hero, and certainly the idea that Peter Parker as a hero, was that he was a defective hero.
Absolutely.
He was a guy who, on his best days, when he succeeded, there was failure within it. And to me, this was just an extension of that. Okay, he will rescue her, but in the rescuing, it will result in her death. And I liked, I was perverse enough to think that was, kind of cool. And I didn't think that it would have the kind of reaction that the fan press had to it, which was as if I had, I'd gone out and killed Dorothy's Toto. If I'd strangled Toto, and it was like, oh my God! And even at the time, I thought, who are they talking about? This girl was nobody. As I realized today there was a great quote from Macbeth that relates to this. Which is referring to a character that was killed in the story. Nothing became as life so much as the leaving of it. What makes Gwen Stacy an iconic character is the fact that she died.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yeah.
That's all she's got. Somebody said to me, why is it that this is, of all the characters in comics who've been killed off, is she the only one who's never come back? I said, because she's only interesting because she's dead.
Hear, hear. And, well, whose idea was it to put the breaking of the neck? Because that
was I take full responsibility for that.
Well, and and I'm not asking if you don't want to say, that's okay, because much like Don McLean in American Pie, I'll let you keep whatever references are still mysterious to you, and you release them when you want to, or I guess like the identity of Deep Throat. But I mean, do you have a firm idea of the circumstance? Because what, as readers, we don't know is what killed Gwen Stacy.
Right.
Was it the fall?
Right.
Was it the grabbing of the web and the snapping of the neck? When did she die?
Well, here's the thing. As far as the characters inside the Marvel Universe are concerned, she died from the fall. The Green Goblin says that, to Peter, and Peter, I think, probably would have killed himself if he believed that he was responsible for what happened to her. So I think inside the Marvel Universe, while people might blame Spider-Man for her death, they don't actually consider him culpable of her death. He's blamed in the same way that George Bush is blamed for things that he's done.
I understand.
Which, you could say yes, he's responsible, but he didn't pull the trigger.
Sure.
In my view, that snick, is probably what killed her.
Wow. You see it
now? Maybe not, but I only put the sound in there because when I saw the picture, and it was not my intention that he killed her, but when I saw the picture and you see the way that Gil drew her, with her body sort of flipping backwards and her head sort of swinging backwards, you get the full impression that at least Gil thought, that there was a kind of a whiplash thing going on there.
Absolutely.
And so putting the sound effect in seemed like the natural thing to do.
Did you ever talk?
I think it was.
Go ahead.
No, I never spoke to Gil about it.
Oh, okay. And what were you going to say? You thought what?
Well, I think that on some level there was this kind of unconscious collaboration between the two of us. Unspoken, undiscussed, here, do with this what you will, from Gil, and me going, okay. The two of us sort of like going, yeah, I think that's what happened. But I don't think either one of us really thought past that. And I've always been surprised by the fact that Roy let it go through as the editor. He saw it. I don't think he thought twice about it.
And then did Stan have any reaction after it came out and was like, hey, what did you do? Wait a minute.
Well, I think Stan didn't realize, first of all, for Stan it was just another story.
Okay.
And he had done this before. He had killed off characters before. But he'd always done it in the traditional Marvel way, of
heroic death.
The heroic death, the guy throwing himself in front of the bullet, a la, Johnny Storm's dad, Johnny M. Sue's dad, or, Gwen Stacy's father, saving the little kid.
Yes.
I mean, all of that stuff. And I, as a member of a more cynical generation, came along and did exactly the same story, but in a kind of I think a kind of a very dark, defeated sort of way. And in the same, I mean, the natural descendant of this story is the Dark Knight. The Dark Knight film, in which Batman rushes to go rescue the woman that he loves and goes into goes to the wrong place. That's not something that would ever have been done in the comics, and probably still to this day would never be done in the comics, where Batman fails like that. Now he, you could say, wasn't culpable for the failure because he didn't, he thought he was going to rescue her. But you could also say that he didn't think it through. That he didn't realize that if the Joker was implying that she was at place X, that she was probably then at place Y, because that would be the joke, right?
Absolutely.
And you could say that he was culpable in that sense.
And what about the Sam Raimi film, the first film? I mean, what goes through your mind as someone who wrote that story and see it play out on the screen, but of course see it play out where the hero is successful and stuff? What were your thoughts as you were watching?
Well, I understood totally. I mean, I wouldn't have done that story as an issue. As the first Spider-Man story. I mean, what a bummer that would have been. Bad enough.
Definitely.
He's semi-responsible for his uncle's death. To then have him, be directly responsible or implicated in the death of his girlfriend, that would have been, what kill us now.
Oh no, I agree with that.
And also, it's a different media.
Sure.
Superhero movies are not for, with the exception of movies like Dark Knight and Watchmen, are not for adults.
Sure.
Or haven't been for adults. So, a story that's supposed to appeal to 13-year-olds. This is why it was so bizarre that we did this story in the comics, as we did. Because at that time, we were still thinking of our audience as 13-year-olds.
Well, and I think I was 9 at the time. Was this 73? What year was this that you did this? Or 71?
73, I think. Yeah,
okay, 73. Yeah, I mean, I was 9. And I mean, and as a 9-year-old, it didn't scar me, but if anything, it blew my mind. And what do you think of the whole I mean, unfortunately, I'm a living example of this as someone in my 40s still reading comics. I can say that you're in the boat with me because,
Sure.
but yeah, what do you think of the medium kind of growing up with its readers and now trying to entertain this adult audience as well?
Well, I think it's fine. I think that it's another mythology that is useful for telling stories with. I was thinking about the fact that the baby boomer generation is we will never let go, of our childhood toys. I mean, look at it. We're still listening to the same music that we were listening to, and we've had such an impact on the world that there has been really no progression outside of, if you take rap music as a progression, but there's been no progression in rock since 1967.
You're right.
It's the same, it's a little faster tempo, but that's basically it. A Coldplay song could play in 1967 and it would be the same, the audience would say, oh yeah, that's good,
Sure.
And that's not, and I'm fine with that, but I'm stunned by it at the same time because that's 40 years later. Go back 40 years before 1967, and you're talking about an entirely different kind of music.
Absolutely.
1927, you're talking about something that would be incomprehensible in 67. How is it that the music of 2009 could be listened to by somebody in 1967 and be recognizable? It's a real statement about how this generation, the baby boomer generation, dominates. And one of the things we're dominating with is our interest in comics. The comics that we read when we were kids, we are now making into movies.
Yeah.
Sam Raimi is not quite I don't know if he's a boomer or not, but he read my stuff when he was a kid. That's the stuff that was his touchstone.
Absolutely.
And so that's what he's interested in telling. That's the kind of stories he's interested in telling.
Wow. What'd you think of Watchmen, the film?
I think I loved it, to be honest. To me, it's Watchmen is to superhero movies what The Wild Bunch was to westerns.
I like that. I could buy, absolutely.
You can go on and continue to make westerns after The Wild Bunch, but really the mythology is dead. It's you have to basically ignore the movie in order to go on and make other movies, and that's what happened with The Wild Bunch. The Wild Bunch summed up an entire mythological structure, and tied it up in a nice, neat knot and put a stake through it. And in my mind, that's what Watchmen has done. I was heartbroken by that film. I loved the comic book, but I tell you that the comic book didn't leave me feeling as sad as the movie did.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. When Rorschach dies at the end of that film, I was heartbroken. And who would have thought? Here you have this character who's an unrelenting madman, and by the end of the movie, you're on his side.
Yeah,
that's an accomplishment, and it's the same thing that happens in Wild Bunch. Where you see these guys who are reprehensible human beings. The first thing that I think William Holden says, is if they move, kill them. And he's talking about these people, they're just ordinary people. And then they go out in the middle of the street and they're just killing everybody around them.
Oh, yeah.
And by the end of the movie, when those guys go walking down, into their deaths, you're feeling like, oh my God, I feel sad for these folks. There's something lost here. And I think that's what was accomplished with Watchmen. I think the fact that the movie wasn't a hit is not surprising to me. I don't know why on God's earth anyone would have financed that film. Seriously.
I understand what you're saying, absolutely.
I'm very glad they did, but they must have been drinking something, or smoking something to think that there was going to be an audience for it. Any more than there would have been an audience for Wild Bunch. I mean, it's surprising that Wild Bunch did find an audience. But if you look at the original critical reaction to Wild Bunch, it was just mercilessly hammered by everybody except, I think, Pauline Kael.
Well, maybe Watchmen too. Then will because it seems like the fanboy, the overwhelming negative response to it it was too on the nose, and that to me always strikes me as odd in terms of that's a negative thing. It's like, well, and also that I think Zack Snyder played to that same baby boomer memory of. I know a big complaint was that the songs were too on, like Sounds of Silence during the funeral, or even Flight of the Valkyries during the Vietnam scenes and stuff. Exactly, and that's the kind of reaction I had. I laughed, too, and in appreciation of that, in terms of course these things fit. Of course you're going to use these songs at those moments. So, maybe time will maybe time will be kinder to it from a fan standpoint than, like you say, what the critics initially thought of it.
Yeah, I do think that it's going to. I think it's going to be a rediscovered movie. I mean, maybe when the director's cut comes out on DVD, people will have a better sense of what it was that he accomplished. But it's in my mind. I mean, I thought it was the best movie of the year, and I still do. And I like a lot of the movies that have come out this year. So I'm not, saying there's a bunch of stinkers out there, but it's a movie that I've seen. I saw it 3 times, and I've only seen Dark Knight once. And the reason I like Dark Knight quite a bit.
Me too.
But I didn't want to go back and re-experience Dark Knight, although I fully intend to at some point. But with Watchmen, I wanted to go back and re-immerse myself in that world and re-engage with those characters. And those characters, I think, were far more empathetic than they were in the comic, and that's without changing anything about them. I don't think that Schneider did anything different with the characters than Alan Moore had done. Just that he made them, I think, more empathetic just by the fact that we could see the pain that they were experiencing. Physically. I mean, Moore constantly talks about how you can't do his comic books as films because of the difference in the medium, the media. Mm-hmm. That comics, you can break a scene down and see fractions of a moment, in slivers of time, and that's absolutely true. But there's also, an upside to that, which is that when you see the film version of something, if it's done well, as I think that Watchmen was done, you get to see things that you couldn't see in the comic book. You get to see the pain in the character's eyes in a way that you couldn't see in a comic book that's frozen in time. And I think, Moore is both correct and wrong. And that's fine too, because he's an icon, and somebody I admire tremendously. But he's not a filmmaker, nor should he be. And, he doesn't see what the language of films brings to things that is not available to him as a comic book writer.
You've been patient with me, and I know I'm keeping you from your dinner, so I just want to ask you in closing, with all that in mind, would you want to write a comic book script and try and do a film? I know you did Fire and Ice, and I hope we have a future conversation where we can talk about that and Firestorm and some of the things that we haven't talked about. That's the great thing about your career, Gerry. I mean, there are so many things to cover, but to leave it on this.
And I'm a talker too. So.
No, and that's honestly, man, I really appreciate it. I know my listeners will too, because. Really, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and I know a lot of people want to know what you think and appreciate your time in the business and your insight in what you see. So would you want to do that? Would you want to write a comic book film script?
Not actually. I don't really want to work in film and television again. So it's not even that I wouldn't want to write a comic book. Although I find myself going, oh, that'd make a cool scene. But the compromises of working in film are such that. Anything that I would do there wouldn't really be mine anyway.
Okay.
By the time it's done, that's a younger guy's medium too. You know, I mean, that's for people who have got the patience and the stamina and the energy and the passion to put up with the crap, you know, that you have to put up with.
John Schulian told me the same thing. The writer, I don't know if you worked with him or not on Hercules, but
which
John Schulian?
Oh, yeah, I think I met him.
Okay. Well, I know he had told me the same thing, that, when he was done with television, he was kind of done.
It's a quote from somebody, you know, that I don't remember the context of it, but just, you know, I'm too old and too rich. I'm not rich, but, you know, I'm too old, certainly, you know, and I don't need to do it the way that I needed to do it back then. And it's that need that gets you through the pain of the compromises, you know, because you're constantly saying to yourself, this is going to be better, you know, the next iteration of this will be better. You know, once I get past this, then it'll be fine, you know, and you're still so caught up and passionate that you believe that that's going to happen. Well, it isn't, you know, and that's what experience and time brings you to, is that you start saying, well, you know, if I haven't done it by this point, I'm probably not going to. That's not to say it can't be done. You know, I think, like, for example, I worked with Bob and Alex Kurtzman and Bob Orsi on Hercules also, and those guys are enormously talented and passionate, and they're getting to make the movies that they wanted to make.
They wrote Star Trek, correct?
Yeah, Star Trek, Transformers, you know, The Island. You know, they're the guys of summer. You know, the boys of summer.
Absolutely.
And they know how to do it, and they've got the passion and the fire to make it happen. And I can't wait to see what they're doing next.
There you go.
They've got it.
Well, I will ask then if we could, maybe a few months from now, maybe as Animal Man is wrapping up, if we could check in again.
Sure.
That would be wonderful. And I like I said, there's so much that we haven't talked about. I know there are Firestorm fans that are tearing their hair out that we didn't have a chance to talk about Ronnie Raymond.
Well, you know, as I say, I'm a talker, so anytime.
Okay, here's my second conversation with Gerry, and I will let time travel John Suntress from 2013 tell you about what the episode is about. Gerry Conway, Part 2, on today's Word Balloon. Time for a new conversation with Gerry Conway. I am a big fan of Gerry's and have been for, most of my comic book reading life. And this is a guy that's only a few years older than me, and he started off as a teenager when he submitted and got his first script accepted from DC Comics, moved over to Marvel, did a lot of big things, and then came back to DC and did even more great things. I mean, what a career. And then, of course, went to television and had an impressive career as a writer for such shows as Murder, She Wrote and Law & Order. And I'm very happy to hear that Gerry's got a new young adults novel in the works. We talk a little bit about that. But I also wanted to get his thoughts on his tenure writing for Superman, and some thoughts as well about what it was like working for DC in the 1970s. That's going to be kind of the theme for the rest of the episode of Word Balloon. So I am pleased to start off with Gerry Conway talking about the old days, but also some new stuff as well on Word Balloon. Did you start at 18? How old were you when you first started DC?
I sold my first story to DC before I turned 16.
Wow.
Yeah, the summer before I turned 16, I basically was going in every week working on one 3-page story with Murray Boltinoff, who for some reason thought that that I'd sold stories to somebody else, so he was trying to use me. And I rewrote the same story like 15 times until he was too tired to continue, I guess. And then he bought it. And from that point on, I was writing and selling stories fairly regularly.
Was that for Brave and Bold or a different time?
No, that was for a book called Tales of the Unexpected. It was what was known at the time as a mystery story. It wasn't really a mystery. It was like a little horror suspense story, a little 3-page thing. And about 8 years later or so, Paul Levitz was editing a compilation of DC stories, and he came across the original story that had never been printed up to that point. And I think just to tease me and embarrass me, he published it. So it came out sometime in the late 70s, I think. And I don't even remember really seeing it. I think Jerry Grandinetti drew it. I'm just pulling that out of my ass, as it were. But I think Jerry did it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was buried for a long time because they stopped doing those books too. They stopped they stopped doing the little horror stories, and I think Murray had a backlog of material that he was a guy who liked to prepare, and it was an easy thing for him to do in between other things. So having a lot of little 3 and 4 and 5, 7, 8 page stories, gave him a lot of flexibility.
That's pretty much how a lot of writers were breaking in back then. Writing those really short stories, obviously. Yeah,
it was a great venue because it didn't risk. The editor was not taking a huge risk with you. I mean, he didn't have to commit one of his main characters. To have you do a story. So doing a little short 5, 6, 7 page featurette was a good training ground for you as a writer or as an artist. It was a great calling card. There was more work potential because they would do an average of 3 stories an issue, which meant that you could break in 3 different writers and artists in any given month on any given title. So it was a great way for people to break into the business. There's really nothing comparable to it now.
True. And also I would think as well, that's kind of tough, I think, to come up with a concise but, plotted out story, a couple characters, get a twist in the story or whatever, and have a satisfying ending.
Yeah. I mean, it was I think in a lot of ways it may seem more difficult in one sense, but because you're writing characters that are not already established, you can't do anything wrong with them.
Sure. Okay.
So somebody can't look at it and say, "Oh, that's not how Aquaman would write." Would say that, or that's not what Batman would do. So the challenge isn't as great in one sense. The risk taking you're taking as a writer is a little bit more focused, and it's your first stories are always difficult whatever you're doing. But I think this was a little bit easier for us. It was a really good training ground for a lot of young writers and artists.
Very cool. So what was it that made Julie Schwartz, tab you to try and start writing Superman?
Well, actually, I had written for Julie before. My career at DC sort of went through 2 phases. They were the first company that I worked for back in the late 60s because they were the first ones that had openings. They had these books, for example.
Okay.
And I worked writing these mystery stories, and I had gained a certain amount of credibility there. And I really wanted to transition into writing, series characters, but there was no real opportunity. I mean, people were just very skeptical and careful,
Okay.
So I was doing work for Dick Giordano. I was doing work for Joe Orlando, and I was also doing some freelance work for Marvel. And Marvel offered me the equivalent of two books a month as a commitment. 40 pages, I think, 42 pages a month, which was a huge amount of work for a kid in high school. It was like, I think I was just graduating high school at the time, or just in my last year at high school. So, even though the rates weren't that great, I would have been making about $100 a week, which was more than my father was making. So it was like
Understood.
A very big deal. So but I still felt a certain amount of loyalty to DC, and I went to DC and I said, is there any way I can get onto a regular book? And at that point, they were taking me more seriously, and I think they thought, well, gee, if Marvel wants him, we want him, so let's see what we can do. And I was offered Batman, of all things. I was offered to write the Batman part of Detective Comics. And
wow.
I was like, wow, that'd be great. But they weren't willing to actually offer me anything more than that. They would continue to give me, fill-in material here and there. And I was really intimidated by Julie. I just didn't know whether I could work for him because he was such a tough guy, and it seemed very intimidating. And on top of that, to be also perfectly honest, I really liked the Marvel books more, and it had been always my dream to write for Marvel. So I said, yeah, I'm going to go work for Marvel, regardless of that. Well, when I came back to DC 5 years later, I was established, as a writer, and part of what happened was Carmine wanted to poke Stan in the eye, by getting all the people that he could from Stan. That's why he got Kirby. That's why he was going after different people.
Sure.
And he went after me. I mean, he didn't so much have to go after me as I was ready to be gotten.
Was this around the time that you had stopped being editor-in-chief, or was it that brief period, or was he?
I was before I was editor-in-chief. This was
okay.
I had been writing for Marvel, doing Spider-Man and
Yep.
before and all of that. And
okay. Yes, blowing my 9-year-old mind with the death of Gwen Stacy, as I've told you before. Yes. Absolutely, man.
Well, the situation was that I felt that I was the next in line to be the editor at Marvel if Roy left. And I had been given, some mealy-mouthed assurances to that degree by Stan, who just didn't want to have to deal with, any stress. So he said, yes, if Roy ever leaves, you're going to be the editor. And I used to fill in for Roy when he was gone. I would come in and hang out for a week, and pinch hit as editor. So I really felt it was my mine to have. Well, as it turned out, when Roy did leave, I was out of the state, on a vacation. Okay. And Stan, in a panic, looked around the office and said, okay, I need somebody to be my editor. Len Wein is the assistant editor. Marv Wolfman is the associate editor on the black and white books. So I'll just promote them. He completely forgetting that he had made a commitment, or something like a commitment. I can't really say it was a commitment to me. And I was, a kid, I was like 20 years old, or something like that. So I had threw a full snit, over this whole thing, and became very, very
understood.
And I was ready to leave, and I looked around for opportunities, and that's where I ended up at DC. Well, when I got to DC, they needed to find work for me, and one of the people that was tasked to do that was Julie Schwartz. And despite my feeling intimidated by him initially, it turned out we actually thought very much alike. I was kind of like the ideal writer for him in a lot of ways, because even though I had not been a plot-oriented writer at Marvel, I was very quickly able to become a plot-oriented writer, that specific kind of DC plotty, twisty storytelling that Julie was enamored of. That became my forte, and we hit it off. And he started throwing more and more work my way. And one of the things that he threw my way, although not on a regular basis, was Superman. The Superman stories in Action Comics, and the occasional. I think I did an occasional feature in Superman itself.
Absolutely, both of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the artist that I worked with, I think, most frequently was Jose Garcia Lopez, and he and I just were like, I really felt like it was a match made in heaven. I really loved working with him. And it was a really wondrul experience.
How did you guys communicate? I mean, was it on the phone, correspondence, both, or through Julie?
Well, Jose, I think, lived in the New York area at that time, so I would see him at the office. But the way that Julie worked was with full scripts. So I would work with Julie on the story, and then write the script, and then that would be given to Jose. But as time went on, I knew what strengths Jose had, and he knew how to bring out what I did well. So the two of us became collaborators through Julie. While we never sat down together and said, let's do this, I could tell what types of stories Jose enjoyed doing, what types of things, what were his strengths. He responded very well to my storytelling techniques, and we actually, did quite a lot of work together. I mean, we did, all those Superman stories. We did some Batman stories too, I think. We did team-up stories. We did Hercules Unbound together. We did Atari Force, and, of course, Cinder and Ash, which was experience for both of us.
Absolutely, man. Great series.
Yeah.
I'm curious about some of these Superman stories from your past. I loved that 300th issue that, was Superman landing either in the year 2000 or something like that, I believe, as I remember. And you did 301, and it was this big fight with Solomon Grundy. Was that the first time Grundy had been used as a Superman villain?
Might well have been. I can't think that there was another time before that.
Was that your idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking for a character who was going to be powerful enough. I mean, theoretically, you still have to upgrade the power of these characters tremendously in order for them to be opponents of Superman. But from a visual point of view, Grundy looked like he could be an opponent of Superman. He looked right, as a Superman villain. He didn't look like, he'd have to. I mean, many Superman villains, because Superman was so powerful, the way that you would play off of that is you'd come up with Superman villains that were intelligence based, that would try to trick him, try to do a Mr. Mxyzptlk on him, or do a Lex Luthor or something else. So the idea of actually coming up with real physical challenges for Superman was something that really didn't start to happen until the 70s. It was, I think, Denny O'Neil and Julie in particular, that started moving in that direction. Although you'd had, characters like the Parasite before that, but the Parasite was a very rare Superman villain. Between the Parasite, I mean, most Superman villains, their gimmick was, how can I get kryptonite near him? That's about it.
Sure.
You have the giant super ape, but the giant super ape's most important power was that he had kryptonite vision.
Absolutely.
You had
Titano.
Right. You had Metallo, who was potentially a very cool character, but again, his big power was that he could open a door in his chest and hit Superman with kryptonite.
Yes, his kryptonite heart. Absolutely.
Yeah, so all of this is taking the character one step back, taking the opponents one step back from an actual face-to-face confrontation. With Solomon Grundy, I thought we could, by fudging it a little bit, come up with, because Grundy was also magic-based, so you
yes.
His powers are magic-based, so therefore he can actually, be a physical opponent to Superman. And he looked like he could be, so.
Absolutely. Were you thinking Hulk at all?
Oh, yeah,
sure. Okay, because, I wonder, and only as far as other than experience and getting more used to working in the comic book format, how much Marvel crept into your new DC work. I understand when you say that you were plot-oriented, but, do you think you brought any?
Thematic,
okay.
Yes. My goal was always, at DC, was always to merge and marry the two styles. I plotted the stories like DC stories.
Sure.
I tried to follow in the footsteps of, Gardner Fox and John Broome, and to a lesser degree, although certainly with respect, Bob Haney. But I wrote them with Stan Lee's voice in my head.
Okay.
And, it was that kind of overwrought, screaming at the top of your lungs type of writing, which today we would never approach it that way.
Understood.
Everything now is very much understated and dry, which I think is great. I think that actually plays very well. But back then, the style that we were all going for was, in your face.
Yeah, bombastic. Absolutely, man. Well, and, great cover to start off 301 with Grundy just belting the hell out of Superman.
Absolutely.
I mean, I remember it well, man. I loved that story. I remember, too, the multi-part story you did where it seemed Supergirl had to break the bad news to Superman that Krypton was a sham and that they were really Earth-born mutants.
Yeah, right. That was a non-starter in a lot of ways. But that's what happens again when you're trying to come up with ways to put the impossible character, Superman, in jeopardy. You can't just do a story in which he's has to deal with an actual enemy that can take him down. You have to play with his mind. You have to play with his sense of reality.
That was really cool. No, I liked it. And there was also the whole, environmental component to the story where he was, kind of stopping tankers, and he was really worried about pollution and that, which obviously in this Exxon Valdez and, I'm forgetting the one from 2 years ago, what it was called. Of course, British Petrol, BP.
Sure.
The BP oil disaster and everything. So, I mean, these were obviously real concerns back then. Were you trying to put a little message in there about the environment?
Sure, sure. I mean, we were very conscious. This was right after. This was in the years after Earth Day.
Sure.
It was after the oil shock. Everybody was very conscious of. We use the word, and it's, I think, loaded with insignificance. The word relevance, we all wanted to be relevant, but I think more honestly, what it was is that we wanted to write stories and draw stories that spoke to our concerns, as young people. We would do, thinly veiled political allegories. We would do not so thinly veiled environmental and ecological stories. Socially conscious stories, to the degree that we were capable of being socially conscious. So it was very much in our minds to follow all of that.
And you were, as you say, part of kind of a rotating group of writers. I know Marty Pasco was writing back then as well. Elliot was still writing back then.
Sure.
Probably Kurt Swan as well.
Carrie
Bates.
Bates, yeah.
Yeah, you read my mind exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That was the again, Julie being kind of an old school guy. One of the things that the DC editors were always concerned about, because production was a driving force at DC in a way that it was not at Marvel. You had a very strong production department that was determined never to miss a shipping date. That was not going to happen. I mean, Marvel, they didn't want to miss shipping dates either, but they missed them all the time. It became a financial crisis at Marvel in the mid 70s, where because they were expanding so much, it was a huge financial problem. Because when you missed a shipping, when you didn't get your book into the printer could. There were several consequences. I mean, one was purely financial, which was you were going to end up being hit with a charge. Because they had to get it out more rapidly. But also, there was a potential quality issue, which was that if your book came in really late and the printer had to run it through really fast, there was a good chance it wasn't going to look that good. As it came out.
Okay.
So DC really was a very well-oiled machine. And part of that being a well-oiled machine was that they built in a lot of redundancies. One of the reasons that you didn't have one writer on a title, with the exception of a handful of books here and there. Like Justice League was one of the very few books that always had the same writer on it. Was because you as the editor wanted to be sure that you were going to have your book in to the production department on time. So Julie, as an old school editor coming out of both pulp and years and years and years of working in the DC system, wanted to make sure that, he could make his deadlines. And one of the ways that you do that is you have several people working on stories simultaneously. That was, I think, given his priorities, that made sense. Unfortunately, it was happening at a time when continuity and character development were crucial to the success of books, and you can't really do that if you're shifting from one writer to another, and throwing stories in out of sequence, or this month you did this, and next month you do that, and so on. So it was a kind of a self-defeating. I mean, it made sense in a lot of ways, but it also did not make sense for the marketplace.
Did it seem like then post-crisis, that's when the shift happened to, or was it even earlier than that you did start having more regular writers?
I think the movement towards it really started happening in the late 70s when people like myself and Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, came to Marvel. Came to DC, and we felt very strongly that we wanted to be the main voices for the titles that we were writing.
Makes sense.
It became clear to us that it was necessary, and we had support in that with Dick Giordano, who was the editor-in-chief, who saw the value in it. All you had to do was look at the numbers, from the difference between a Marvel title and a comparable DC title. Marvel was just selling better. And it was not that their books, from a sheer quality point of view, were absolutely better. They were, some of them weren't. But on average, they sold better. So, if you're looking at it from the overview of what can we do as a company to improve our standing, one of the things you do is you try to emulate what Marvel does. And one of the things Marvel did was they had regular writers and artists, less so regular artists, because something has to give in those situations, and
sure.
Fill-in artists at Marvel were their way of handling it. Fill-in writers were the way that they handled it at DC. So, you start looking at back and forth, and you say, which one is going to do more damage to the long-term success of a book? And we say artists want to think that comics are an artist's medium. They're really not. The fact is that they are writer-driven. And while an individual artist can make a book, temporarily popular, if the story and the writing isn't at the same level as the artist's work, that book is not going to be a success. So DC figured it out.
Yeah, I agree with you. And at the time, I think, your television work was getting, bigger and bigger. So it was during that 90s period, I think, when art took over that I checked out. That was the last time I checked out for a long period of time on comics, because the stories were suffering. And it wasn't until that 1999 period when a bunch of new writers, were given the shot.
Yeah, people like when Jeff Johns came in, Jeff really brought back the idea of the writer as star. And that's a foolish leveraging, because the truth is it's the team, but you need the strong writer. You need a strong literary point of view, because ultimately this is literature. It's not just pictures.
Yes, comic books. Absolutely.
Comic books. And, you couldn't translate this stuff into so many different media if it was just about the visuals, because there would be nothing to translate. Because if it's just the visuals, once you remove the visuals and you go for example, you're not going to have, no matter what you do, the Superman movie that's coming out in June is not going to look like a Jim Lee comic book. What it can feel like a James Robinson story. See what I'm saying?
I do. No, absolutely. And I think I think from the trailers, what little we know right now, it reminds me of Jeff's Secret Origin that he did a couple of years ago with Gary Frank.
Well, there's a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, Jeff is somebody who has a lot of clout,
oh yeah.
And so, for good or ill, it's like, I mean, I think on the case of Green Lantern, it was for ill, but I think that overall it's for good. You need somebody who's got an eye towards the mythology to make these comic book movies work. Marvel has Kevin Feige, who for somebody who's like not from the comic book business, he's got it. I mean, he's totally understands, the comic book mindset. He's a fan. I mean, you can tell that he's a fan. But he's a good fan, and he's not a fan in the sense of it can't be changed. He's more like a fan in the sense of wouldn't it be fun if?
Yes,
which is exactly what you want, and to an extent that's what you had with Christopher Nolan. Although in his case it was his brother and David Gower who were the fans. They were the ones who got Batman. I think Chris Nolan rode their shoulders, to be honest. It's like, very effectively, but I think they were the real creators of that world.
Agreed. Are you watching Da Vinci's Demons, Goyer's new show?
No, I haven't watched it yet. I mean, I'm so far behind. I mean, I'm like I just there are a handful of shows that I watch on TV. Like I am a big fan of Person of Interest, for example, Jonathan Nolan.
Very cool.
Yeah, very, very cool show. I think that's a great show. I'm a big fan of Fringe. Was a big fan of a lot of these things. I do want to watch Da Vinci's Demons. It's on my list. And I think it's going to replace something that was on my list that I sort of like was feeling under this obligation to watch because everybody was saying that it was a good show. And every time I would watch it, I would say to myself, this is a really awful show. And that was Revolution. The
NBC show, yes, the sci-fi show. Go on.
I just hate that show. I mean, it's like everything that I think is wrong with television science fiction is in that show. It's just an abomination, by my standards. I mean, starting with the fact that Billy Burke is not a credible military man. There is literally no way that guy would have lasted 5 minutes, in a SEAL team. They would have just fucking killed him. And the idea that we're supposed to believe that he was the most kick-ass, bad-ass no, come on. It's just, and it goes downhill from there. It's like every single aspect of this thing is just people running in place as far as I'm concerned. It's just terrible.
The pilot didn't grab me, and I didn't watch anything since, so I can appreciate that.
I keep wanting to like it. It's sort of like I feel like it's the medicine I'm supposed to take. And I just watched an episode last night, which is why I'm thinking about it because it's episode 4 or 5, something like that. But the problem is, what it did is my desire to be a good boy and watch that show because it's one of the few successful science fiction shows on the air. I was putting off watching anything else because I felt like I've got to get well into this one first. And so every time I would sit down to watch TV and I'd say, well, I guess I should watch Revolution. Well, I really don't want to, so I'll do something else. So I ended up not watching it, and then I ended up not watching something else either. It's terrible. I've decided officially it's off my list. I'm taking it off my queue. It's gone.
Cool. Back to Superman. We're still a few weeks away from the movie. What are your feelings based on what you've seen?
I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, they have a really tough row to hoe with that character. This is probably next to somebody like Robin Hood or Tarzan, one of the most familiar characters in popular culture. It's really hard to do something with the character that is both true to the character, true to what he is, and new. Right? I mean,
sure.
When we see attempts to, like, for example, a few years ago when Ridley Scott did an updated version of Robin Hood with Russell Crowe, it was a disaster because he wanted to do something new with this very, very familiar character, but in the process, he lost what made that character iconic. I mean, the whole deal with Robin Hood is that he's, a man of the forest. First of all, he's in the forest. That's like real important. In the forest, Sherwood Forest. That's Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and gives to the poor. The rest of it, everything else is irrelevant. It's gilding the lily. So what does Ridley Scott end up doing? He takes him out of the forest. He loses the essential idea of him as an outlaw. It's there, but it isn't there. There's nothing remotely romantic about the figure. And the climactic set-piece battle is on a fucking beach. I mean, how does that even happen? It would be like me saying about Superman. Okay, here's our first thing. He comes from he's from an underground world. His powers are that he can turn invisible. He's gay. It's like. All of this would be very new. Yes, it would be. It would all be completely wrong. So it's got nothing to do with the character. So I look at what they're doing and I say to myself, this is a very fine, careful retelling of the story. How do you do it without alienating the basic beats, but keep the beats fresh? And it seems like they've managed to come up with a way to do that. I mean, one of the great resources that Superman has as a mythology is that, in parallel to the Christ story, Superman is a figure who actually, I mean, if you write out the whole Superboy mythology, which I would strongly urge anybody to do, if you just take Superman as a basic character, he exists in two particular times of his life. He exists when he was found by the Kents and initially was a young child, right? And then the second time he exists is as a young man, after he has become Superman. So you end up with this period of time in his life, which is sort of like Jesus between the time of, being born, in the creche and, confronting, coming out of the desert, to start his ministry.
Yep.
So there's this great empty space that you have between those two times where you can tell the story, right, of how did he become the man? Mm-hmm. That's a legitimate story that's not really been brought into focus in any of the media versions of Superman. Smallville to an extent has tried to do it, but that was a CW show, and it was more about the soap opera elements than really challenging that arc, that character.
I understand. Yeah, and I would agree that they stretched it out too. I mean, they stood in place for years.
Oh yeah. Well, that's true. It was a TV show,
Well, that's true too.
Yeah. But yeah. So taking Smallville and Superboy out of the equation, which you really have to, because even though they are part of the mythology, they've never really been used organically to justify who Superman is as an adult, right? Batman, the whole Batman story is about his emotional crisis and his decision to become Batman. But Superman arrives in Metropolis, puts on his Clark Kent glasses, and decides to fight crime. Why? When you really come down to it, why on earth would he do that? That I think is a fascinating story that in the comics has only really been touched on tangentially now and then. It's never been an essential part of the mythology. We've always leapfrogged it. We've always gone from the Kents found him, instilled him with, down home values, and now here he is in Metropolis and he's writing for the Daily Planet. I think that there's a good story there, and I think that that's what I see in the promos, and from what I've heard, that's the story arc that they seem to want to be focusing on, and I think it's a really smart way to make something new.
I like it. I also remember back in the 70s, some of those backup features, The Private Life of Clark Kent, but the one, and it's a shame, it seems like it would have been an opportunity to tell these stories, was that Superman, the in-between years, where it was like his college years and stuff, as he wasn't quite, the man yet, but he wasn't Superboy anymore either.
We weren't the guys at that time to do that, because we were not we were not myth makers at that moment. We were the 70s and 80s and the 90s to probably even more so were about deconstruction. They were about taking the myths and breaking them down. And that's not a value judgment. It's just simply saying that was how we were operating. We were seeing the flaws in the system. That as a culture, that's what we were doing, in general.
Attributing more that they couldn't be the two-dimensional characters that they were, and kind of, rather than I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying to figure out another way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, in other words, we were looking at the contradictions, in the essence of these characters. Just as there was a great story that Mike Friedrich did, which I think promoted the relevance era for Green Lantern, which was he asked the question, why would a guy with the power that Green Lantern have, why would he let the world be so miserable? It's the God question. In a lot of ways, it's the problem of God. The problem of evil, to use the theological questions. Well, that was something that we were all sort of questioning to a degree. It's like, if in the real world these characters had these powers, what would that really mean? We weren't looking at how did they get these powers, how did they become the people they were? Those are origin questions, and we had accepted the origins. We weren't questioning the origins. That came later. That came with people like Frank Miller, doing Batman Year One. That was, I think, the breakthrough conceptually, in trying to tell these stories. But for the most part, the period that I'm talking about, the 70s and 80s, we were deconstructing the mythology. So people like Jeff Jones come along and, brilliantly, they reconstruct it. they do the origin stories. They do the how did you get here stories. Why did you become the man you are stories. And that's where this new Superman movie, I think, fits.
That's interesting, and I wonder if people haven't thought of calling that post-deconstruction era the Reconstruction era.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
You're right. That's funny.
I think it is true. I mean,
Sure.
it's people like Jeff and people like Michael Bendis and people like Matt Fraction and Warren Ellis and
Sure.
all of these very talented writers who, after these poor characters were pulled apart like flies, in the hands of angry children, they put them back together, and they put them together brilliantly, because they it gave them the opportunity of starting from scratch emotionally, saying, who were these people? I remember reading something that Jeff did with a character that I had created, Commander Steele. He did a story. He brought Hank Haywood into the Justice Society, and
yes.
He justified the character. And one of the things he did that I thought was so great, because it was inherent in the character's backstory, but I had never really done anything with it, which was, this was Hank Haywood the Third, right? Mm-hmm. Which, when you say that, and if you're somebody from the outside looking at it and analyzing it, as opposed to somebody like me who was simply trying to write a character that would be the grandkid of another character that I created, so I wasn't thinking it through. I was just trying to come up with a rationale. What Jeff did is he said to himself, "Oh, this is a guy who's been raised in a family in which family connections are extremely important. This is a guy whose life history is about family. And he's a guy who's weighted down by that. So he takes it and he makes the symbolism of the fact that, he's an invulnerable guy, but he's also extremely heavy, right? So he takes all of this and he plays with it thematically and creates an organic origin for the character that's true to the character and enhances the character and gives the character an emotional arc. Well, that's Reconstruction, and I think that's great. I think we have a lot to be thankful for all of these guys, because they came to this material, and as I say, these poor characters had been picked apart,
sure,
and left, lying bloody on the ground. Humiliated, trashed, turned evil, and they came in and rebuilt them from the ground up.
I remember that one panel in particular in JSA when Commander Steele is surrounded by the kids in his family.
Yes, exactly.
And you're right. It's that one image and that one thought that really does give the character a new depth. I agree.
Exactly. And that's when I got Jeff. That was when I, as a reader and as a writer, saw that he was operating on another level, another level of insight that I really liked and respect. I mean, I don't like everything he does. I mean, I think he tends to get too plotty, in a lot of ways, and
okay.
Goes off on tangents and everything. But he's got the right take, and to the extent that he can, that he is an influence, on the movies for DC, that'll be a good influence. If other people can come in and sort of rein in the parts of him that aren't that good, at what he does, because we all have those strengths and weaknesses. I mean, I can catalog my own strengths and weaknesses fairly easily.
I thought you were going to.
No, I'm not a masochist,
I understand.
Besides which, anybody who reads my books can certainly categorize them fairly easily.
Well, I haven't seen you come back to comics since that Last Days of Animal Man story, and I honestly think that that was a really great animal story, Gerry. I really do, and I thought you did a lot of what you're describing there in terms of trying to explain who Buddy was, and especially at that point in his life too.
Yeah, well, I try to when I was writing comics in the 70s, I was writing from my own perspective, as a young adult. I mean, I got to write Peter Parker at the age that Peter Parker was. I mean, I was, Peter Parker's age. The experiences that I was writing about were reflections of my own experiences. Not throwing my girlfriend off the bridge and stuff like that, but just the normal young adult issues. So I got to write that. Well, when I got to the opportunity to write a miniseries for DC, the notion that I had was, well, what is relevant to me, as a man in my 50s? Well, what's relevant to me as a man in my 50s is, the loss of my abilities, the natural consequences of getting older. Is that, I'm not as fast as I used to be. I'm not as smart as I used to be, making the immediate connections with things. I can't write as quick as I used to, nor should I, which is a good thing, I think.
Okay.
And so when I wrote that story, what I was doing was I was looking into my own heart and coming up with my own emotional anchor. And I think that's what makes any writer's work worth reading, and any artist's work worth looking at, is if it's coming from a place where you're trying to express something inside yourself that hopefully has a greater resonance than just your own, insecurities or your own neurotic issues. I mean, hopefully you're speaking about something that is universally human.
Sure. Do you think do you think you'll come back and write another comic story?
Well, I've pitched various things to various people, but nobody's picked up on any of the things that I've pitched. So you'd really have to ask them.
Okay.
I would love to do another miniseries or maybe another monthly or something, but I haven't really found anything that where the fit has worked. I mean, part of the problem is that the way that comics are done these days is not the way that I did them, and I don't know that people would trust me to do them these days. Editors have a much more hands-on approach to story than the editors I worked with. I don't think that way. I mean, that's like when I go on a series, for example, if I was to take over a series, it would be very hard for me to tell my editor what I plan to do in 6 months. I just don't think that way. I throw out breadcrumbs, and follow them as they lead, and that, to me, that's fun. That's part of the experience. For me and the reader is to see, where is this all going to lead? Let's find out.
You're on the journey with the characters. Yeah. You're not sure where he's going to turn.
Absolutely, and I think that serendipity is partly why comics were so full of life back in the 70s. Because we were all on that journey. We were all, making it up as we went along, to quote Indiana Jones. And it worked. These days, the stakes are so high for both companies. They have massive investments, not just in the monthly comic books, but in the ancillary material, which is actually now the most critical and important material. You
mean like the TV shows?
The TV shows and movies. I mean, Marvel exists as a development agency for Disney. Warner Brothers has made it clear that DC is a development tool for them.
Yep.
I mean, that was always going to inevitably happen. It just that it is now formalized and very much, very much a bureaucratic reality. So.
Well, what about, I'm sure you're aware of, these creators that are kind of doing their own thing. They're taking books to Image, or certainly Kickstarter is now part of the conversation very much.
Yeah. There are a couple of projects that I have that I would like to possibly develop, on my own. Part of it is I don't know that very many artists in the business, so there's not like a lot of people that I can call up and, I mean, there are people my age, but, they've got jobs, they've got work, they've got lives,
Understood.
Talented young people are the people that can work on these new projects, and I don't know that very many of them. I'm hoping to make more contacts. I'm going to be at Comic-Con this year, and
terrific.
That'll be interesting. I'll be on a lot of drugs. I don't do well in big crowds, and boy, oh boy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, Gerry, I'm sorry to hear that, man. I missed you at. I wasn't at this year's Pulp Show at Windy City, but I know
either.
Okay, well, I know in previous years you've been at shows, and I've missed you by a couple hours or whatever. Wow, man. Well, I was going to ask if are you going to be on a panel or anything? Or
no, I'm an invited guest, so I don't know what that means.
Oh, excellent.
That means that I know I'm going to be doing some there's going to be at least some autographing. They've got an autograph table and stuff like that. And I would assume, I can't imagine that they would have me there without putting me on a panel or two.
Sure.
The main reason I'm going, to be honest with you, is my daughter wants to go, and it was like they invited me, and I said, yeah, that'd be good. But I know I'm gonna be like, I will have to take drugs because I really don't do well in large crowds. I like the kid who's, I'm like the deer in the headlights. It's like, what? It's like,
oh boy. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you'll, like you said, as most special guests, they do have a table and stuff. So, people will be coming to you, and I'll certainly make a point of coming by and saying hello.
I'll be there. Yeah. So.
Oh man! All right. Well, it's all right. God, now I feel bad for you.
Oh, don't feel bad. No, it's my problem. It's a really. I make it bigger than it is. But
I understand. Well, the good thing will be, I'm sure a lot of people will just come up and want to say hello and tell you how much they've enjoyed your stories and stuff. And I've sat in line listening to those kinds of stories as it was my turn to talk to Stan Freberg or Jerry Robinson and the like. So no, man, that's cool. And good. I really do hope that you find somebody to collaborate with, or maybe it's you follow Stephen Cannell's example before he passed and start writing the novels and stuff. And you said, when you're
I am writing a novel. I am writing a young adult novel right now. So we'll see how that turns out.
Oh, fantastic!
I thought I was going to be done with it before the convention so that I could have it in print at the convention. I don't know whether I'm going to. It's getting close. I'm not. Okay. I've got like 100 pages to go, and I'm not sure whether it's going to.
Is it an original character?
It's an original. It's going to be an original series. It's I call it a mashup between Hogwarts and Cthulhu. So it's kind of
interesting.
It's a young adult novel set in the Cthulhu universe. So it's a kind of a Lovecraftian young adult world.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm having fun with that. I'm writing it particularly with my daughter in mind because she's the audience. I wanted to do something that she would enjoy reading. And there you go.
That's really cool, man. That's excellent. Very, very cool. And also I spoke to Ralph Bakshi earlier this year, and I have.
No.
Well, no, I understand. And I had heard that Robbie Rodriguez was interested in remaking Fire and Ice.
Yeah. Theoretically, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. Now I feel like I'm stepping on a landmine. Is this?
It makes no difference. Roy and I wrote that. I don't even know what the right situation is because we wrote it and theoretically it was written under the Writers Guild. But which would mean that we have to be compensated if there's a sequel or a remake. We need to be involved in it in some way. But the rights on that film went through so many different hands. It's really hard to know, whether anybody is going to even be looking out for that. Plus, Rodriguez is not a member of the guilds. So,
right.
It's a whole nother issue, which then becomes,
I understand. That's right. He left the Directors Guild when they were kind of angry that he was going to let Frank Miller co-direct, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Well, I think he also just didn't want to have to deal with the guild. I mean, he is a
maverick.
Well, a maverick, but he's a low budget filmmaker who manages to achieve a lot of the bang for your buck effects that he does by operating outside union supervision.
Understood.
So, he can say that it was for creative reasons. I think it was for financial reasons, because by taking himself out of the union, it gives him free reign to do things that he wouldn't be allowed to do otherwise. But it also means that he doesn't get the recognition that any director would want to have, of potentially being recognized as a great director. I mean, I think if he had really wanted to make that work, he could have. Look, the Wachowskis and Tom Twyker managed to make it work for Cloud Atlas. The Guild finds ways to work with you, but he chose to step outside that. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous for him to say that it was, because the Guild was holding him back in some way.
Understood. No, okay, because what about the original experience with Fire and Ice? You and Roy wrote it, as you say.
Well, we had a really good experience. I mean, Bakshi was a crazy person, in a lot of ways, but so are we all. He's very passionate. He gave us he really gave us a shot, at doing something worthwhile, and so I give him a lot of credit for that. But here is the problem. We were working on this film, and as we're writing and plotting and developing it, it became very clear to us that we were writing a 2-hour movie. And in 1981, or whenever it was that we did it, animated features never ran more than 82 minutes. That was like a hard and fast rule. 90 minutes was about the limit for an animated feature. There were a lot of reasons for that, financial and so on. But it's also true that if you're not going to go a full 2 hours, this is back in the day when film canisters were the medium of projection, right? You put film in canisters and you carried it from one place to another. Well, distributors wanted to have either 3 canisters or 4 canisters. If you were going to, minimum was 3. The minimum length for a film was 82 minutes, because that's 3 canisters or 3 reels. Not reels, I mean 3 45-minute, it's 2 reels, I'm sorry, it's 45-minute reels, whatever it was. But the point is, you had a bump up, right? If you're going to go up, you're going to go up to a full 2 hours, or you're going to stay at 90. So it's an either-or situation. And we also knew that Bakshi had never done a 2-hour movie other than The Lord of the Rings, which was a flop. And we were like, okay, you're not really going to shoot this as a 2-hour movie, right? I mean, we need to start thinking about how we're going to cut this. And he was like, no, we don't worry about it. We're going to shoot it as a 2-hour movie. We're like, but we don't think that's going to happen. He refused to let us work on a script that was 90 minutes long. So he ended up shooting it. He shot it as a 2-hour movie for rotoscoping. That was his preferred way of doing features with human characters in them. Mm-hmm. Well, he shot it as a 2-hour movie with actors on set, and then he cut it to 90 minutes. Well, because the easiest thing to cut in an animated film is dialogue, he ended up cutting all of the material that basically told you what was going on. All the dialogue exchanges, all the interactions with characters where they would, introduce each other, introduce their story. We ended up, as Roy and I said to people who asked us what we thought of the film, we said, well, every word that we wrote is in that, every word in the movie is what we wrote. But not every word we wrote is in that movie. So the movie makes no sense, but it made sense when we wrote it.
Okay, man, now I'm relieved to hear you say that, because that has been a film that
Yep.
I remember watching in high school and probably was under some influence, and then bought it since and everything on DVD, and
this doesn't really make much. Who is that guy? Why is he doing that? Who are these people? What's that about? It's like, who was that masked man? As our agent said when he saw the screening of it, he said, "Who was that masked man?" And it was like, who was that masked man? We don't know, because we never had the opportunity to tell you. It's like,
man.
So that was frustrating.
Did you have any direct give and takes with Frazetta at all during the project?
We met him once or twice.
Okay.
Didn't really have anything to do with the film. I mean, he came in early on to do some design work. He talked with the animators a bit. I don't know what Bakshi tells people. But my impression, working on the project for about a year, was that Frank was there at the beginning. Bakshi wanted to use some of his iconic imagery, and he didn't really want to have to deal with Frank, after that, because Frank is a strong-willed, individual, and so is Ralph. Two guys from Brooklyn butting heads. It's two Italian guys from Brooklyn butting heads. Not going to go over well. Actually, Polish and Italian. So it's like not a good mix, but they. So I don't know. I mean, I never saw Frank that involved.
I understand. Well, honestly, I don't want to take too much of your time, Gerry. I want to give you a chance to enjoy the night, and but can we talk in a few months, because this is the 50th anniversary of Spider-Man too, I guess, right?
Sure. Yeah,
and
isn't it? Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So I appreciate the Superman-centric conversation and stuff, and we've talked about Spider-Man before, but it'd be great to talk a little bit more on the anniversary year. So yeah, all right, I'll bug you in a few months, and thank you for the stories as always, and the memories, and I'm glad that you got the young adult book coming up. Really, please take advantage of the soapbox here, and when it's ready to talk about, you're welcome back.
All right, we'll have fun. I'll talk to you later.
There you go, another great conversation. 2 hours of Gerry Conway. I hope you enjoyed it on today's Word Balloon, all brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you very much, League, for your great support. Once again, Word Balloon Patreon supporters got to listen to a very long 2-hour Matt Fraction conversation that's brand new. Will be coming out this week from Word Balloon. They got to hear it first last week, and that's what I try to do in addition to other things for Patreon subscribers. I'm trying to expand the program here, give you a little bit more video and a few other things as well. And patrons will get them first, but if you want to subscribe, you like what you hear on Word Balloon and want to help out the cause, go to patreon.com/wordballoon or click on the Patreon ad on the front page of wordballoon.com. Word Balloon also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. Aftershock has a lot of great books that are not only coming out in November, but also December. Things like the Dark Red first volume from Tim Seeley. Unbelievable stuff there. There's Dark Arc. Volume 2 is underway from Juan Doe and Cullen Bunn. There's Deception from Juan Doe, his great solo series. You got Animosity from Marguerite Bennett. You're also going to get Volume 2, Year 2 in December here from Marguerite and Aftershock Comics. And also Volume 1 is being represented as well. There's also the trade for Volume 5. Baby Cates Volume 3 from Donnie Cates and Gary Brown. There's also God Killers #1 coming in December. Very cool series. There's You Are Obsolete from Matthew Klickstein. Matthew coming up on Word Balloon in the days ahead. There's The Man Who Effed Up Time. Pretty goddamn funny and typical of Aftershock Comics' sense of humor. There's Shoplifters Will Be Liquidated #5. There's Undone by Blood, another great Aftershock book. #1 coming out in December. Great books, great concepts, Aftershock Comics. Go to their website and learn more. You'll find a book that's right for you. You'll find preview pages of art, also full story descriptions, and the diamond codes on how to order these books through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Thanks a lot for listening. More great stuff this Thanksgiving week here on Word Balloon. Be watching your feed, and you'll see more great new interviews and classic interviews as well from Word Balloon. Thanks a lot. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2019.